2 weeks after changing his will, a man who spent his whole life searching for genuine love was found dead. And the last words his wife spoke were the first cracks in the story that would expose everything. Welcome to True Crime Story HQ. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe. Marvin Elijah Washington was born on March 7, 1985, at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. His parents, Leonard and Patricia Washington, had waited 7 years for a child. 7 years of fertility treatments. 7 years of disappointment. 7 years of prayers that seemed to go unanswered. When Patricia finally became pregnant at 34 years old, she and Leonard treated every day as a gift. They painted the nursery yellow. They argued over names for months. They imagined baseball games, graduations, and grandchildren. What they did not imagine was a delivery room filled with concerned faces and whispered conversations. Marvin was born 3 weeks premature. He weighed 4 pounds, 11 ounces. And within hours of his birth, doctors noticed something was wrong. His limbs were positioned at unusual angles. His muscle tone was significantly reduced. His reflexes were inconsistent. At 6 weeks old, Marvin was diagnosed with arthrogryposis multiplex congenita, a rare condition that affects the joints and muscles, causing them to develop abnormally before birth. In Marvin's case, the condition primarily affected his legs and lower spine. He would never walk without assistance. He would require multiple surgeries throughout his childhood, and he would spend his entire life navigating a world that was not built for his body. Leonard Washington, a construction foreman who had spent 30 years building things with his hands, stood in the hospital corridor and wept. Not because his son was broken, but because he already knew the world would try to convince Marvin that he was. I want you to pause here and consider something. How do you raise a child to believe in their own worth when the world constantly reminds them of what they cannot do? Leonard and Patricia Washington faced this question every single day, and the answer they came up with shaped everything Marvin would become. The Washington family lived in a modest 3-bedroom home in Decatur, Georgia, a working-class neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and children played in the streets until the streetlights came on. Leonard worked 60-hour weeks to pay for Marvin's medical bills. Patricia, a former elementary school teacher, left her job to become Marvin's full-time caregiver. Together, they made a decision that would define their son's childhood. They refused to treat him differently. While other families with disabled children focused on limitations, the Washingtons focused on possibilities. When Marvin was 5 years old, Leonard built him a custom wheelchair ramp for the front porch. But he didn't stop there. He built ramps at the homes of relatives. He built a ramp at the local church. He built a ramp at the barber shop where he got his haircut every other Saturday. Leonard Washington was not a wealthy man, but he spent every spare dollar he had making sure his son could go everywhere other children could go. Patricia's approach was equally intentional. She enrolled Marvin in the same schools as his peers. She insisted he participate in field trips, school plays, and science fairs. When other parents suggested that Marvin might be more comfortable in specialized programs, Patricia smiled politely and said, "My son is exactly where he belongs." By the time Marvin was 10 years old, he had developed a reputation in the neighborhood, not as the boy in the wheelchair, but as the kid who always has a book and the one who helps you with your homework. Marvin Washington was brilliant. His IQ tested at 142, placing him in the top 0.1% of his age group. He read at a college level by age 12. He taught himself to code by age 14. He won regional science competitions despite having to present his projects from a seated position while other students stood at podiums. His mind was extraordinary. But his heart was what made him vulnerable. Because despite his intelligence, despite his accomplishments, despite the love his parents poured into him every single day, Marvin Washington grew up believing one thing above all else. That love, romantic love, was something he would have to prove he deserved. And that belief would become the foundation for everything that followed. High school is difficult for everyone, but for Marvin Washington, It was a masterclass in emotional contradiction. Academically, he excelled. He was valedictorian of his class at Southwest DeKalb High School. He received scholarship offers from Georgia Tech, Emory, and Morehouse College. He was featured in local newspapers as an example of perseverance and determination. But socially, Marvin existed in a strange middle ground. He was respected. He was admired. He was never invited. The football players said hello in the hallways. They did not invite him to parties. The girls in his AP classes complimented his intelligence. They did not accept his invitations to prom. Marvin attended exactly one school dance during his 4 years of high school, the junior year Sadie Hawkins dance, where girls were supposed to ask boys. A classmate named Tamika Rhodes asked him as a friend. They took photographs together. She spent most of the night dancing with someone else. Marvin sat by the refreshment table, watching. Years later, in a journal entry that would be read aloud in court, Marvin wrote about that night. "I learned something important at that dance. People can be kind without being interested. They can smile at you without seeing you. They can include you in photographs while excluding you from their lives." I don't blame Tamika. She was 16. She didn't know what she was doing. But that night taught me that kindness and love are not the same thing. And I spent the next 15 years trying to figure out the difference. This distinction between kindness and love would become the central question of Marvin Washington's adult life. And it would be the question that Dominique Harris exploited with devastating precision. Have you ever confused someone's kindness for something deeper? Have you ever interpreted politeness as affection or helpfulness as attraction? For most people, these misunderstandings are embarrassing but survivable. For Marvin Washington, this confusion would become fatal. Because the woman who eventually entered his life understood this vulnerability better than anyone, and she used it against him from the very first conversation. On February 3, 2015, Patricia Washington collapsed while cooking dinner, a massive stroke. She was pronounced dead at Emory University Hospital at 9:47 p.m. She was 62 years old. Leonard Washington, who had spent 40 years building things that would outlast him, could not survive his wife's death. 6 months later, on August 19, 2015, he died in his sleep. The official cause was heart failure, but everyone who knew him understood the truth. Leonard Washington died of grief. Marvin was 30 years old when he buried both his parents within 6 months of each other. He was alone for the first time in his life. No siblings, no extended family to speak of. Just an empty house in Decatur and a lifetime of memories. And then, the attorney called. Leonard and Patricia Washington had been quietly accumulating wealth for decades. Leonard's construction company, which he had started in 1998, had grown significantly. Patricia's careful investments, money she had saved from her teaching years, had compounded over time. And there was a life insurance policy that neither parent had ever mentioned. When the estate was settled, Marvin Elijah Washington inherited $7,542,000. $7.5 million, enough to buy a mansion, enough to travel the world, enough to hire full-time caregivers and live comfortably for the rest of his life. But Marvin did something that would later confuse investigators and fascinate psychologists. He hid it. He kept the money in trust accounts that were not connected to his daily banking. He continued living in his parents' modest home. He continued driving a 10-year-old Honda Odyssey with a wheelchair lift. He told no one about the inheritance, not his co-workers at the software company where he worked remotely, not the few friends he had maintained from college, not the caregivers who helped him with daily tasks. No one. When asked about this decision during the investigation, Marvin's brother Darnell, who we will meet later, explained it simply. Marvin didn't want money to be the reason someone loved him. He'd spent his whole life wondering if people saw him or just saw his wheelchair. Adding millions of dollars to that equation? He knew it would make everything worse. He wanted someone to choose him because of who he was, not because of what he had. This decision, to hide his wealth, was born from a place of profound vulnerability. But it would become the very thing that made him a target. Because Dominique Harris did not discover Marvin's wealth through his actions. She discovered it through research. Careful, deliberate, patient research. And by the time Marvin realized what was happening, it was already too late. Between 2015 and 2018, Marvin Washington lived a quiet, solitary life. He worked from home as a software developer for a medical technology company, a job that paid well and required minimal physical presence. He attended church every Sunday at Greater New Birth Baptist Church in Lithonia. He volunteered twice a month at a local food bank, where he helped organize donations and manage inventory. He dated occasionally, women he met through online platforms designed for people with disabilities. But these relationships never lasted. One woman, interviewed anonymously during the investigation, described their 3-month relationship. Marvin was the kindest man I ever met. Genuinely kind. Not the kind that wants something from you. The real kind. But he was also guarded. Like he was waiting for you to disappoint him. Like he'd already decided you would leave. And eventually, I did. Not because of his disability. Because I couldn't convince him that I wasn't going to hurt him. He didn't believe he was worth staying for. And that's exhausting to fight against every single day. This pattern repeated itself across multiple relationships. Marvin would meet someone. He would be charming, intelligent, and generous. He would also be suspicious, self-protective, and quietly convinced that the relationship had an expiration date. And eventually, it would. By early 2018, Marvin had essentially given up on romantic love. He was 33 years old. He had money he didn't spend, a home he rarely left, and a heart that had been disappointed so many times he'd stopped expecting anything different. He told his brother Darnell during a phone call in February 2018, "I think I'm done looking. Maybe some people aren't meant to be loved that way. Maybe I just need to accept that and focus on other things." Darnell, who lived in Charlotte with his own family, didn't know how to respond. He told Marvin he loved him. He told him not to give up. He promised to visit more often, but he didn't push. He didn't argue. He didn't know that his brother was about to meet someone who would see that resignation and recognize it as an opportunity. 6 weeks after that phone call, Marvin Washington matched with a woman on a dating app. Her name was Dominique Harris. She was 31 years old. She was beautiful. She was attentive. She asked questions about his life, his interests, his dreams. She never once mentioned his disability, and Marvin, after years of loneliness and disappointment, let himself believe. That decision would cost him everything. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, if you recognize pieces of Marvin's loneliness in yourself or someone you love, take a moment right now to subscribe and share this video with them. Because what you've heard so far is only the foundation. The woman who entered Marvin's life didn't stumble into it by accident. She studied him. She planned for him. And what she did next will change the way you look at every relationship around you. Stay with me. The truth is just beginning to surface. To understand how Dominique Harris became capable of murder, you have to understand where she came from, and more importantly, what she learned to survive. Dominique Lachey Harris was born on November 12, 1987, in Macon, Georgia, a mid-sized city known for its music history and its struggles with poverty. Her mother, Vanessa Harris, worked as a hotel housekeeper. Her father, Marcus Harris Sr., was in and out of her life, appearing occasionally with gifts and promises, then vanishing for months at a time. By the time Dominique was 7 years old, her father had stopped coming entirely. No explanation, no goodbye. Just silence. Vanessa, overwhelmed and underpaid, did her best to raise Dominique and her 2 younger brothers alone. But her best was not enough. The family moved frequently, evicted from apartments when rent came due. Dominique changed schools 4 times between kindergarten and 5th grade. She learned early that stability was not something she could depend on, and she learned something else too. She learned that people could be convinced to give you things. If you knew how to ask, if you knew how to smile, if you knew how to make them feel like helping you was their idea. A teacher from Dominique's elementary school, interviewed decades later, remembered her vividly. Dominique was one of those children who figured out the system early. She knew which teachers would let her turn in late work if she apologized sweetly. She knew which lunch ladies would give her extra food if she complimented their cooking. She wasn't manipulative in a mean way, not yet. She was just a hungry kid who learned that charm was a tool, and she got very, very good at using it. This early adaptation, learning to survive through strategic emotional performance, would become the foundation of Dominique's adult personality. She wasn't born a predator. She was shaped into one. By circumstances, by necessity, by the absence of anyone who taught her that honesty could be just as effective as manipulation. Dominique's first documented manipulation of a romantic partner occurred when she was 17 years old. His name was Jamal Thompson. He was 19, a sophomore at Mercer University, and the first person in his family to attend college. Dominique met him at a community basketball game in the summer of 2004. She was beautiful. Everyone said so. Long braids, bright smile, a laugh that made people turn around to see where it came from. Jamal was immediately interested. What he didn't know was that Dominique had asked around about him before approaching. She knew his family had money, not wealthy, but comfortable. She knew he had a car. She knew he was generous. Their relationship lasted 11 months. During that time, Dominique convinced Jamal to pay her cell phone bill for 6 consecutive months, give her $3,000 for community college tuition that she never enrolled in, and co-sign on a car loan that she stopped paying after 4 months. When Jamal finally confronted her about the missing tuition money, Dominique's response was remarkable. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She cried. She told him she was embarrassed. She said she'd been too ashamed to tell him she'd failed the entrance exam. She begged him not to leave her, and Jamal, confused, guilty, still in love, forgave her. 3 weeks later, Dominique was seen at a nightclub with another man. When Jamal confronted her again, she told him she needed space to figure out who she was. He never saw her again. The car was repossessed. The debt went to collections. Jamal's credit was damaged for 7 years. And Dominique Harris moved on to her next opportunity. This pattern, identifying a target, building emotional dependency, extracting resources and disappearing, would repeat itself at least 4 more times over the next decade. Each time, Dominique refined her technique. Each time, the stakes got higher. And each time, she learned something new about how far she could push before someone pushed back. I want you to consider something uncomfortable. How many times have you ignored a pattern because you wanted to believe someone could change? How many times have you explained away behavior that should have been a warning? The people who loved Jamal Thompson probably asked these same questions. The people who loved Dominique's other victims probably asked them too. And the answer is almost always the same. We believe what we want to believe, until we can't anymore. Between 2008 and 2017, Dominique Harris left a trail of damaged relationships across Georgia. A man in Savannah who gave her $15,000 for a business venture that never materialized. A man in Augusta who proposed to her and later discovered she was simultaneously engaged to someone else. A man in Athens who she convinced to add her to his apartment lease, then locked out of his own home after a staged argument. In each case, the pattern was identical. Phase 1 was identification. Dominique would research potential targets before making contact. She preferred men who were lonely, financially stable, and eager to please. She found them at churches, community events, and increasingly, on online dating platforms. Phase 2 was idealization. Once contact was made, Dominique became the perfect partner. She listened intently. She remembered small details. She anticipated needs before they were expressed. She made her targets feel seen in ways they had never experienced before. Phase 3 was dependency. Gradually, Dominique would create situations where her targets felt responsible for her well-being. A fabricated family emergency, a sudden job loss, an unexpected medical bill. Each crisis required rescue, and each rescue deepened the emotional bond. Phase 4 was extraction. Once dependency was established, Dominique would begin asking for larger and larger commitments. Access to bank accounts, co-signed loans, added to insurance policies. The requests were always framed as expressions of trust, not transactions. Phase 5 was exit. When she had extracted what she wanted, or when her target began questioning her behavior, Dominique would manufacture a dramatic exit. Accusations of jealousy, claims of emotional abuse, sometimes simply vanishing without explanation. By 2017, Dominique had refined this process to an art form, but she had also attracted attention. A detective in Savannah had opened an informal investigation after 3 different men filed civil complaints against the same woman. Her name was appearing in background checks. Her options were narrowing. She needed something bigger, something that would set her up permanently. And then she heard about Marvin Washington. Not from him. He was careful about his privacy, but from someone who worked at the law firm that had handled his parents' estate. A casual conversation at a bar. A mention of that disabled guy who inherited millions and lives like he's poor. A spark of interest, and a plan that began forming in Dominique's mind that very night. No discussion of this case is complete without understanding the role of Terrell Jackson. Terrell was born in College Park, Georgia, in 1984. He was athletic, handsome, and profoundly unreliable. By age 30, he had held 23 different jobs. He had been evicted from 6 apartments. He had 2 children by 2 different women, neither of whom he supported financially. He had been arrested twice, once for petty theft, once for check fraud. He was exactly the kind of man that Dominique Harris's victims believed she would never be interested in. But Terrell Jackson had been Dominique's secret boyfriend since 2012. 6 years. Through every relationship she manufactured, through every man she deceived, through every dollar she extracted, Terrell was there, waiting, planning, benefiting. Their arrangement was simple and transactional. Dominique would find the targets and build the relationships. Terrell would provide emotional support, logistical assistance, and, when necessary, physical intimidation. The money was split. The secrets were kept. And their relationship, hidden from everyone except a handful of trusted associates, continued uninterrupted. The Marvin Washington case was different from anything they had attempted before. The stakes were higher, the target was more vulnerable, and the plan, for the first time, included murder. It was Terrell who first suggested it. According to text messages recovered during the investigation, the conversation happened in December 2017. Terrell wrote, "He's got millions and nobody watching. This could be the last one." Dominique responded, "What do you mean the last one?" Terrell replied, "I mean we do this right. We don't have to do it again. Ever." Dominique wrote back, "That's different than what we usually do." And Terrell's response, "It's not that different, just more permanent." The word permanent would appear 17 more times in their communications over the following 18 months, each time referring to the same thing: Marvin Washington's death, and the inheritance that would follow. Here's the question that investigators asked themselves repeatedly during this case. At what point does manipulation become conspiracy to commit murder? Is it the first conversation about permanence? Is it the first research into a target's finances? Is it the first lie told to gain someone's trust? The legal answer is clear. Conspiracy requires intent and planning. But the moral answer is more complicated, because by the time Dominique Harris sent that first message to Marvin Washington, she already knew how this story would end, and she did it anyway. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you. This channel exists because of viewers like you who believe these stories deserve to be told. If you want to go deeper, if you want access to extended episodes, behind-the-scenes research, and exclusive content that never makes it to the main channel, consider joining our YouTube membership. Your support doesn't just unlock perks for you. It helps us keep investigating, keep producing, and keep bringing these stories to light. The link is in the description. Now, let's continue. On March 14, 2018, Marvin Washington received a message on a dating app called Able Match, a platform specifically designed for people with disabilities and those interested in dating them. The message was simple. "Hi Marvin, I saw your profile and I wanted to reach out. You seem like someone who thinks about things deeply. I like that. I'm Dominique. What are you reading right now?" Marvin had received messages before. Most of them were brief. Some were fetishistic. People attracted to his disability in ways that made him uncomfortable. Some were condescending. People who wanted to help him rather than know him. But this message was different. It didn't mention his wheelchair. It didn't ask about his medical condition. It asked what he was reading. Marvin responded within an hour. "Currently working through Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. It's dense, but worth it. What about you?" Dominique's response came 20 minutes later. "I've been meaning to read that one. Right now I'm rereading The Color Purple by Alice Walker. There's something about Celie's voice that stays with me every time." What Marvin didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that Dominique had spent 3 days researching his social media profiles before sending that first message. She knew he posted about literature. She knew his favorite authors. She knew exactly what kind of intellectual conversation would capture his attention. The book she mentioned? She had never read it. But she had read the Wikipedia summary that morning. This was Dominique's gift. She could become whatever someone needed her to be. And Marvin Washington needed someone who saw his mind before his body. So that's exactly what she gave him. Over the next 6 weeks, Marvin and Dominique exchanged hundreds of messages. They discussed books, philosophy, religion, and family. They shared photographs, carefully curated images that revealed just enough. They talked about loneliness, about disappointment, about what it means to hope for something that feels impossible. Dominique was masterful. She never rushed. She never pushed. She let Marvin set the pace, and she made sure that every conversation left him wanting more. On April 2nd, Marvin asked her why she had joined a dating app for people with disabilities when she was able-bodied. Her answer would be quoted in court documents. "Honestly, because I've dated a lot of men who had perfect bodies and terrible character. I realized I was looking in the wrong places. I wanted someone who understood that life isn't about what your body can do. It's about who you are inside. Does that make sense?" It made sense. It made perfect sense. It was exactly what Marvin had been waiting to hear his entire life. What he didn't know was that Dominique had practiced that answer. She had rehearsed it with Terrell. She had refined it based on Marvin's previous messages. She had crafted it specifically to bypass every defense Marvin had built around his heart. And it worked. On April 18th, 2018, 5 weeks after their first message, Marvin asked Dominique if she wanted to meet in person. She said yes. She said she'd been hoping he would ask. She said she was nervous. And Marvin, for the first time in years, felt hope. They met at a coffee shop in Decatur on April 21st, 2018. Marvin arrived 20 minutes early. He had asked his caregiver to help him pick out an outfit, something he hadn't done in years. He was nervous. He was excited. He was terrified. Dominique arrived exactly on time. She was wearing a simple yellow sundress. Her hair was natural, pulled back. She smiled when she saw him, not the polite smile Marvin was used to, the one that said, "I'm being nice to you." This smile reached her eyes, or at least it looked like it did. She walked directly to his table and sat down across from him. "You're even more handsome in person," she said. Marvin laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh. "I was just thinking the same thing about you," he said. They talked for 4 hours. The coffee shop closed around them. Staff members began stacking chairs. Neither of them noticed. At the end of the night, Dominique did something that would stay with Marvin forever. She leaned across the table, took his hand, and said, "I know people probably treat you differently because of your chair. I just want you to know. I don't see the chair. I see you. And I really like what I see." Marvin cried in his car on the way home. Not from sadness, from relief. He called his brother Darnell that night. "I think I met someone. I think this might be real." Darnell was happy for him. He was also cautious. "Just take your time," he said. "Let her prove herself." Marvin promised he would. But in his heart, he had already decided. He had already begun to believe. And Dominique, lying in bed next to Terrell that same night, was already calculating the timeline. Over the following months, Dominique became a constant presence in Marvin's life. She visited his home 3, then 4, then 5 times a week. She helped him with tasks his caregivers usually handled, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She cooked meals in his kitchen. She fell asleep on his couch during movie nights. She attended church with him. She met his friends from the food bank. She made herself indispensable, and throughout it all, she never once asked about money. This was perhaps her most brilliant tactical decision. She knew that Marvin was waiting for the moment when her interest revealed itself to be transactional. So she made sure that moment never came. When Marvin offered to pay for dinners, she insisted on splitting the bill. When he mentioned buying her a gift, she said she didn't need anything. When he asked about her job, she claimed to work as a home healthcare aide. She said she was comfortable, not wealthy, but fine. She even fabricated financial struggles of her own, small crises that she handled independently without asking Marvin for help. This performance served 2 purposes. First, it reinforced Marvin's belief that she wasn't interested in his money. Second, it created opportunities for Marvin to offer help on his own, help that she would graciously accept only after initially refusing. Each time Marvin insisted on helping, Dominique let him think it was his idea. Each time she accepted his generosity, she framed it as a sign of trust, not transaction. And Marvin, who had spent years building walls against people who wanted his resources, never even saw the walls coming down, because Dominique didn't climb over them. She convinced him to remove them himself. Darnell Washington first met Dominique in July 2018. He had driven down from Charlotte specifically to meet the woman his brother couldn't stop talking about. The dinner was pleasant. Dominique was charming. She asked about Darnell's children. She complimented his wife. She seemed genuinely interested in family. But something felt wrong. Darnell couldn't identify it that night. But over the following weeks, he found himself returning to small moments that didn't quite fit. The way Dominique watched Marvin when she thought no one was looking. Not with affection, but with assessment. The way she deflected questions about her own family. Vague answers about estranged parents and siblings she didn't talk to anymore. The way she touched Marvin in public, performative, almost theatrical, as if she was aware of being observed. Darnell mentioned his concerns to his wife, Angela, after the visit. "I don't know. Maybe I'm being overprotective, but something about her doesn't sit right with me. It's like she's playing a role." Angela told him to be careful. "Marvin has been hurt before," she said. "If you say something and you're wrong, he might not forgive you. Let him figure it out on his own." Darnell agreed. He promised himself he would stay watchful. He promised himself he would be ready if something went wrong. But he didn't say anything to Marvin, not yet. That decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. Here's a question worth considering. When you sense something is wrong with someone you love, how long do you wait before saying something? How much evidence do you need? How certain do you have to be? Darnell Washington struggled with these questions for months. By the time he had enough certainty to act, his brother was dead. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your location in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you've made it this far into the video, prove it. Leave a comment that says, "I'm still here." Let's see who's really paying attention. Because the next chapter, it's where everything changes. On December 24th, 2018, Christmas Eve, Marvin Washington proposed to Dominique Harris. They were sitting in his living room, a fire burning in the fireplace, lights from a small tree reflecting off the windows. Marvin had hidden the ring for 3 weeks. He had rehearsed what he would say dozens of times, and when the moment came, he abandoned all of it. He simply said, "I've spent my whole life feeling like I was asking too much just by existing. Like wanting love was greedy. Like expecting someone to choose me was unrealistic. You made me feel different. You made me feel like enough. I don't have pretty words for this. I just know I don't want to live without you. Will you marry me? Dominique cried. She said yes. She held him for a long time. What Marvin interpreted as overwhelming emotion was, in fact, relief. The plan was working. Phase 1 was complete. That night, after Marvin fell asleep, Dominique sent a text message to Terrell. He proposed. I said yes. We're almost there. Terrell's response, good girl. Don't rush the next part. Let him think it's his idea. The next part referred to the legal documents that would transfer Marvin's wealth into Dominique's control. The will, the life insurance, the joint accounts. All of it would need to change. And Dominique knew exactly how to make it happen. Between January and August 2019, Marvin Washington made a series of legal changes that would later be described by prosecutors as the most predictable tragedy in Georgia legal history. On January 15, 2019, Marvin added Dominique as a beneficiary on his primary checking account, the one that received his salary deposits. This was presented by Dominique as a practical decision since they would soon be married. On March 3, 2019, Marvin updated his health insurance to include Dominique as his spouse once they were married. This required paperwork that Dominique helpfully offered to submit on his behalf. On May 22, 2019, Marvin met with his financial advisor to discuss restructuring his investment portfolio. Dominique attended the meeting. She asked clarifying questions that later seemed designed to establish exactly how much Marvin was worth. On August 1, 2019, 14 days before his death and 13 days before his wedding, Marvin Washington signed a new last will and testament. The previous will, drafted after his parents' deaths, had left everything to charity, specifically to organizations supporting people with disabilities. The new will was different. It named Dominique Harris as the sole beneficiary of his entire estate. $7.5 million, plus real estate, plus vehicles, plus investment accounts. Everything. When asked why he was making this change, Marvin told his attorney, "She's going to be my wife. She's the only family I'll have. I want her taken care of if something happens to me." The attorney, a man named Harold Jennings, who had known the Washington family for 20 years, later testified that something felt off about the meeting. Dominique did most of the talking, he said. Marvin seemed distant, happy but distant, like he was going through the motions of something that had already been decided. Jennings asked Marvin if he was sure about the changes. Marvin said yes. Jennings asked if he wanted to include any provisions, charitable donations, trusts, conditions. Marvin said no. Dominique had told him that complicated wills created unnecessary legal problems. She had told him that simplicity was a sign of trust. She had told him that questioning the will was questioning their love. So Marvin signed. Everything he had, everything his parents had worked for, everything that represented his security, his independence, his future. Gone. With one signature. 14 days before he would be found dead. On August 15, 2019, Marvin Elijah Washington married Dominique Lachey Harris at Greater New Birth Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia. It was a small ceremony. 32 guests. Marvin's side included his brother Darnell and his family, a few colleagues from work, and members of his church community. Dominique's side was notably sparse. She explained that her family was complicated, that she had chosen distance for her mental health, that the people who mattered most were the people in her new life, not her old one. None of Dominique's former victims were present. None of them even knew she was getting married. The ceremony was beautiful by all accounts. The pastor spoke about love overcoming obstacles. He spoke about Marvin as a man who had waited patiently for God's timing. He spoke about Dominique as an answer to prayer. Marvin cried during his vows. Dominique cried during hers. The photographs show two people who appear to be deeply in love. In one image, Dominique is leaning down to kiss Marvin's forehead while he sits in his wheelchair. In another, she is pushing him down the aisle, both of them laughing. These photographs would later appear in news coverage of the murder. They would be analyzed by experts for signs of deception. They would be studied by the jury during the trial. And they would haunt Darnell Washington, who stood as best man that day, smiling in photographs beside a woman he had suspected, but not stopped. After the wedding, there was a small reception at a rented hall. There was dancing, there was cake, there were toasts. And then Marvin and Dominique went home, to the house that Marvin's parents had built, the house where he had grown up, the house that was now shared with a stranger. 14 days later, Marvin Washington would be dead, and the woman in those wedding photographs would be counting his money. Take a moment to consider the timeline. Engaged on December 24th, will changed on August 1st, married on August 15th, dead on September 14th. 44 days between the will change and the death. 30 days between the wedding and the death. Was this coincidence, or was it calculation? The next chapter will answer that question. But I suspect you already know. Marvin and Dominique did not take a honeymoon. The official reason was practical. Marvin's condition made extended travel difficult, and they wanted to settle into married life before planning a trip. The real reason was different. Dominique didn't want to wait. Text messages recovered from her phone showed conversations with Terrell during the week after the wedding. On August 18th, Dominique wrote, "He wants to go to Hawaii in October." Terrell responded, "That's too long." Dominique replied, "I know. I'm stalling." Terrell wrote back, "Don't stall too long. People start asking questions." Dominique's final message, "I know what I'm doing." The questions Terrell referred to were the kind that arise when newlyweds don't behave like newlyweds. When the wife seems distracted, when the husband seems tired, when the happiness that should fill a new marriage is replaced by something quieter, something that looks like waiting. Marvin noticed the change. In a journal entry dated August 22nd, 7 days after the wedding, he wrote, "Something feels different. I can't explain it. She's here, but she's not here. She looks at me like she's thinking about something else. I asked her if everything was okay. She said she was just tired from all the wedding stress. Maybe that's true. Maybe I'm being paranoid. I always do this. I always look for reasons to doubt. Maybe this is just what marriage feels like. Adjusting. Settling. Learning to share space with someone who isn't used to your routine. Maybe I need to give it time." He gave it time. He had 23 days left to live. What Marvin did not know, what he could not have known, was that Terrell Jackson had been inside his home, multiple times, while he slept. The hidden camera that Darnell had installed captured 3 separate visits between August 20th and September 10th. Each visit followed the same pattern. Terrell would arrive late at night, after midnight, when Marvin was asleep in the master bedroom. Dominique would let him in through the garage entrance, a door that Marvin rarely used because of its inaccessibility for his wheelchair. They would talk in the kitchen. They would review the plan. They would sometimes argue about timing. The audio quality from Darnell's hidden camera was inconsistent. The device was small and not designed for professional surveillance, but certain phrases were clear enough to be entered into evidence. On August 23rd, Terrell asked, "When are we doing this?" Dominique responded, "Soon. I need to make sure the insurance paperwork is processed." Terrell pushed back. "It's been processed for weeks." Dominique insisted, "I need to be sure. If something goes wrong..." Terrell interrupted. "Nothing's going to go wrong. You've done this before." Dominique's voice dropped. "Not like this. This is different." Terrell's response was chilling. "Different how? He's an easy target. Easier than any of the others." That phrase, "easy target," would become central to the prosecution's case. It demonstrated premeditation. It demonstrated callousness. And it demonstrated that Dominique had discussed Marvin with Terrell in terms that reduced him to nothing more than an obstacle between her and his money. On September 10th, 4 days before the murder, the hidden camera captured a conversation that left no room for interpretation. Dominique said, "Friday night, after dinner, he takes his medication around 9. By 10 he'll be out." Terrell asked. "What if he wakes up?" Dominique replied, "He won't wake up." Terrell pressed, "But if he does?" There was a pause. Then Dominique spoke again. "Then you do what you need to do." 4 days later, Marvin Washington was dead. The events of September 14, 2019 have been reconstructed through a combination of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the recordings from Darnell's hidden camera. What follows is the most accurate timeline investigators could establish. At 6:30 p.m., Dominique prepared dinner, grilled chicken, rice, and vegetables. She served Marvin at the kitchen table. They ate together. The conversation appeared normal. At 7:45 p.m., Marvin moved to the living room to watch television. Dominique cleaned the kitchen. She sent a text message to Terrell. An hour. At 8:15 p.m., Dominique brought Marvin his evening medication, a combination of muscle relaxants and sleep aids that he took every night. She watched as he swallowed the pills. At 8:45 p.m., Marvin told Dominique he was tired and wanted to go to bed early. She helped him transfer from his wheelchair to the bed, a process that required physical assistance. She kissed his forehead. She told him she loved him. At 9:02 p.m., Dominique sent another text to Terrell. "He's out." At 9:34 p.m., Terrell Jackson's vehicle was captured on a neighbor's security camera entering the Washington property through the back alley. At 9:41 p.m., Terrell entered through the garage door. Dominique was waiting. Between 9:45 p.m. and 10:15 p.m., the events that occurred during this window are the subject of medical examiner testimony and forensic reconstruction. What is known with certainty: Marvin Washington died of asphyxiation. He was smothered with a pillow. There were no defensive wounds on his body, suggesting he was either asleep, sedated, or unable to resist. The official cause of death was later recorded as asphyxiation due to mechanical obstruction of the airways. The manner of death was ruled homicide. At 10:47 p.m., Terrell Jackson's vehicle was captured leaving the property. At 11:02 p.m., Dominique called 911. "My husband isn't breathing. I think he's dead. Please send someone. He promised he would never leave me. Not like this." That final sentence, "He promised he would never leave me. Not like this," was the first crack in Dominique's performance. Because Marvin Washington had never made that promise. He had never used those words. It was a line from a romance novel Dominique had been reading that week, a detail that a diligent detective would later discover and present to the jury. She had rehearsed her grief, and she had borrowed the script. Before we continue, I want you to sit with what you've just heard. A man was murdered in his own bed, by his wife, while he slept, unable to fight back, unable to call for help, unable to even know what was happening. The next chapter will show you how the investigation unfolded, how a brother's guilt became a brother's crusade, how a hidden camera became the key to justice, and how two people who thought they had committed the perfect crime discovered they had made one critical mistake. Marvin Washington was buried on September 21, 2019, 1 week after his death. The funeral was held at Greater New Birth Baptist Church, the same location where he had been married 37 days earlier. Over 200 people attended, members of the disability community, colleagues from his work, volunteers from the food bank, people whose lives Marvin had touched without ever realizing the impact. Dominique wore black. She cried through the entire service. She clutched a photograph of Marvin against her chest. She collapsed during the burial. By all external appearances, she was a widow destroyed by grief. Darnell Washington stood 10 feet away, watching. He had flown in from Charlotte the morning after Marvin's death. He had spent the intervening week in a state of emotional paralysis, grief for his brother, guilt for not protecting him, and a growing suspicion that he could not yet articulate. The night before the funeral, Darnell had a conversation with the family attorney, Harold Jennings. "The will was changed 2 weeks before he died," Jennings said. "Everything goes to her now." Darnell felt his stomach drop. 2 weeks. 13 days to be exact. I asked Marvin if he was sure. He said yes, but something about that meeting didn't feel right. Darnell asked what he meant. She did most of the talking, Jennings said. Dominique. She had answers ready for every question I asked, like she'd practiced. Marvin just sat there nodding. That night, Darnell couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the hidden camera, the one he had installed months ago, the one he had never checked, the one that might contain answers, or might contain nothing. Either way, he knew he had to look. On September 22, 2019, the day after the funeral, Darnell Washington drove to his brother's house. Dominique was there, but she was preoccupied with insurance paperwork. She barely acknowledged Darnell's presence. He told her he needed to collect some of Marvin's personal items, photographs, documents, memories. She waved him toward the office. "Take whatever you want," she said. "I'm too tired to deal with it." The hidden camera was concealed inside a decorative clock on a bookshelf in the living room. Darnell had placed it there during a visit in June, 3 months before the murder, after his suspicions about Dominique had become impossible to ignore. He had told no one about it. Not Marvin, not his wife, not anyone. He had checked it once in July and found nothing unusual. Just recordings of Marvin watching television, Dominique cooking, normal, boring footage. He had almost removed it then, almost decided he was being paranoid. But something stopped him, some instinct he couldn't name. Now, standing in his dead brother's home, he removed the memory card from the clock and slipped it into his pocket. He drove to a hotel. He plugged the card into his laptop. And he began to watch. The first several days of footage showed nothing remarkable. Marvin and Dominique living their lives, cooking, talking, watching television. But then, Darnell reached August 20th, and he saw Terrell Jackson walk through the garage door at 12:47 a.m. He watched Dominique greet him. He watched them talk in the kitchen. He heard the words, "easy target." He heard the words, "do what you need to do." He watched the recordings from September 10th. He heard Dominique's voice. Friday night, after dinner. Darnell stopped the video. He sat in silence for a long time. Then he began to cry. Not quietly, not with dignity. He screamed. He threw the laptop against the wall. He fell to his knees and sobbed until he couldn't breathe, because he realized something that would haunt him forever. If he had checked the camera earlier, even 1 week earlier, Marvin might still be alive. The guilt was unbearable, but it was also transformative. Because in that moment, Darnell Washington made a decision. He would not let his brother's killers walk free. He would find justice, or he would destroy himself trying. On September 23, 2019, Darnell Washington walked into the DeKalb County Police Department with a laptop and a memory card. He asked to speak with a detective. He was introduced to Detective Mariana Santos, a 15-year veteran of the Homicide Division. She listened as Darnell explained who he was. She listened as he described his suspicions. She watched as he played the recordings. When the footage ended, Detective Santos sat in silence for a full minute. Then she asked, "Does Dominique know this camera exists?" Darnell said no. "Does anyone else know?" Darnell said no. Detective Santos nodded slowly. "This is valuable," she said. "But I need you to understand something. These recordings alone aren't enough for a conviction. We need corroboration, physical evidence, witnesses. A confession would help." She looked directly at Darnell. "I also need you to understand that if Dominique finds out about this camera before we're ready to move, she will run. And if she runs, we may never find her." Darnell understood. "What do you need me to do?" "Nothing," Santos said. "You've done enough. Let us handle the rest." For the next 4 months, Darnell watched from the sidelines as the investigation unfolded. He answered questions when asked. He provided additional context about Marvin's life. He attended meetings with prosecutors, but mostly he waited. And the waiting nearly destroyed him. Detective Santos and her team worked methodically over the following months. They subpoenaed phone records. They interviewed neighbors. They examined Marvin's financial accounts. They tracked Terrell Jackson's movements on the night of the murder. What they discovered was a web of deception spanning years. The phone records revealed text messages between Dominique and Terrell dating back to 2012, a long-term conspiracy. The prosecution would later catalog over 2,000 messages discussing targets, timelines, and exits. Marvin was referred to as the disabled guy, or simply him, in most of these messages. The financial trail showed that Dominique had begun transferring money out of Marvin's accounts within days of his death. Small amounts at first, $500 here, $1,000 there, designed to avoid triggering fraud alerts. By the time of her arrest, she had moved over $47,000. A neighbor's security camera captured Terrell's vehicle entering and leaving the Washington property on multiple occasions, including September 14th. The timestamps aligned precisely with the recordings from Darnell's hidden camera. But the most damaging piece of evidence was discovered on Dominique's computer. On September 12th, 2 days before Marvin's death, she had booked 2 first-class tickets to the Maldives. Departure date, October 1st. The passenger names were Dominique Harris and Terrell Jackson. Total cost, $24,000. Paid from Marvin's credit card. She had planned her escape before her husband was even dead. By late January 2020, Detective Santos had enough. She presented the case to the district attorney. Arrest warrants were issued on February 3, 2020. And on February 4th at 6:47 a.m., Dominique Harris answered a knock at the door of the Stone Mountain house, the house she had inherited from the man she killed, and found 12 police officers waiting. She was handcuffed in the doorway. Terrell Jackson was arrested 45 minutes later at his mother's house in College Park. Both were charged with first-degree murder. Both were denied bail. And both, for the first time in years, faced consequences they could not manipulate their way out of. Justice is not always swift. Sometimes it takes months. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it never comes at all. For Marvin Washington, justice took 4 months and 20 days. For his brother Darnell, it would never be enough. Because no verdict can undo a death. No sentence can return what was stolen. And no amount of punishment can answer the question that still haunts everyone who knew Marvin. What if someone had acted sooner? If you made it to this point, you're not just a viewer. You're part of this community. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now with the words, "I made it," so I know who stayed. And while you're there, tell me, where are you watching from? I want to see how far Marvin's story has traveled. Let's fill that comment section with locations from around the world. The interrogation of Dominique Harris lasted 7 hours. It was conducted by Detective Santos and her partner, Detective Michael, in a small room at the DeKalb County Sheriff's Office. For the first 3 hours, Dominique maintained her performance. She cried. She protested her innocence. She demanded to know why she was being treated like a criminal when she was still grieving. She asked for water. She asked for tissues. She asked for a phone call. She played the role of the wronged widow with the same precision she had brought to every other role in her life. Detective Santos let her perform. She asked simple questions. She took notes. She waited. And then, at the 3:22 mark of the recording, she said, "Dominique, I want to show you something." She placed a photograph on the table. It was a still image from Darnell's hidden camera, time-stamped August 23, 2019, showing Terrell Jackson standing in Marvin Washington's kitchen. Dominique's expression didn't change. "Who is that?" she asked. "You tell me," Santos said. "I don't know. I've never seen him before." Santos nodded. She placed another photograph on the table. This one showed Dominique and Terrell together, his arm around her waist, at what appeared to be a nightclub. It was from 2016, pulled from a social media account that Dominique had thought was deleted. "How about now?" Santos asked. Dominique said nothing. "His name is Terrell Jackson," Santos continued. "You've known him since 2012. You've been in a relationship with him for 8 years. He was in your husband's home on the night Marvin died. And right now, he's in an interrogation room down the hall, telling my partner everything." Dominique's composure finally cracked. "He's lying," she said. "Whatever he told you, he's lying. He says you planned this together. He's lying. He says you told him when Marvin would be asleep. He's lying. He says you watched while he—" "I didn't watch." The room went silent. Dominique realized what she had said. She tried to recover. I wasn't there. I don't know what you're talking about. But it was too late. In 8 words, she had confirmed everything. She hadn't said, "There was nothing to watch." She hadn't said, "Marvin died of natural causes." She had said, "I didn't watch," which meant something had happened, something she could have watched. Detective Santos leaned forward. "Dominique," she said quietly, "I think it's time you told us the truth." Dominique Harris never provided a full confession. She maintained until the very end that Terrell had acted alone, that she hadn't known what he was planning, that she was a victim too. But over the remaining 4 hours of interrogation, the story she told revealed more than she intended. She admitted that she and Terrell had been together for years. She admitted that she knew about Marvin's inheritance before they met. She admitted that she had researched him. She admitted that the relationship was strategic. She admitted that she had helped Terrell enter the house on multiple occasions. She admitted that she had sent text messages coordinating his visits. But she insisted, again and again, that she didn't know he was going to kill Marvin. "I thought he was just going to scare him," she said at one point. "Make him sign over more money. I didn't know it would go that far." Detective Santos asked if she had tried to stop Terrell. Dominique was silent. "Did you call for help?" Silence. "Did you check on your husband?" Silence. "How long did you wait before calling 911? Dominique looked at the table. "I don't remember." The medical examiner would later testify that based on body temperature and other indicators, at least 90 minutes had passed between Marvin's death and the 911 call. 90 minutes. While her husband's body cooled in the bedroom, Dominique Harris had cleaned the kitchen, changed her clothes, and rehearsed the lines she would deliver to the operator, including the line about promises, including the tears, including the performance that almost worked. If this story moved you, if it made you think, made you feel, made you want to protect the people you love, then do me one favor. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like Marvin's don't just inform, they protect, they warn, they save lives. The trial of Dominique Harris and Terrell Jackson began on October 5, 2020. Due to COVID-19 restrictions, the courtroom was limited to essential personnel, immediate family, and a small pool of journalists. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Natalie Chen, presented a case built on 3 pillars. First, premeditation. The text messages, the recorded conversations, the vacation booking, all of it demonstrated that Marvin's death was planned months in advance. This was not a crime of passion. This was not an accident. This was murder, calculated and executed with precision. Second, motive. The will change, the insurance policy, the financial transfers. Dominique stood to gain nearly $10 million from Marvin's death, and she had begun spending that money before his body was in the ground. Third, opportunity. Dominique was the only person who knew Marvin's medication schedule, his sleep patterns, his vulnerabilities. She had created the conditions that made the murder possible. She had unlocked the door. She had waited for her husband to fall asleep. She had texted Terrell when it was safe. The prosecution called 23 witnesses over 8 days. The hidden camera recordings were played in their entirety. The jury watched as Terrell Jackson called Marvin an easy target. They watched as Dominique coordinated the final night. They listened as she said, "I didn't watch," a phrase that Prosecutor Chen called the most damning 2 words spoken in this case. When the prosecution rested, the defense had little to work with. Dominique's defense attorney, Ronald Bishop, attempted to portray his client as a victim of Terrell Jackson. He argued that Dominique had been manipulated, that Terrell was the mastermind, that Dominique had been coerced into participating through threats and intimidation. It was a strategy that might have worked if the evidence had cooperated, but it didn't. Text messages showed Dominique as the planner, not the follower. Financial records showed that she controlled the money, not Terrell. And the hidden camera recordings showed a woman who was calm, confident, and completely in charge. Terrell's defense was simpler. He blamed everything on Dominique. His attorney argued that Terrell had been promised a share of the inheritance in exchange for helping with unspecified tasks, that he didn't know those tasks would include murder, that he was as surprised as anyone when Marvin died. This defense also failed. The recordings were too clear. The planning was too detailed. The coordination was too precise. Both defendants were found guilty of first-degree murder on October 19, 2020. Dominique screamed when the verdict was read. Terrell sat in silence. Neither showed remorse. On November 12, 2020, Judge Patricia Hammond sentenced Dominique Harris and Terrell Jackson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Before the sentence was announced, Darnell Washington was given the opportunity to deliver a victim impact statement. He stood at the podium for a long time before speaking. When he finally found his voice, the courtroom fell completely silent. My brother spent his whole life being underestimated. People looked at his wheelchair and decided they knew who he was. They decided he was weak. They decided he was helpless. They decided he was less. But Marvin was more than anyone ever gave him credit for. He was brilliant. He was kind. He was generous to a fault. He was the best man I ever knew. And all he wanted, the only thing he ever asked for, was to be loved. Not pitied, not tolerated. Loved. You. Darnell paused, looking directly at Dominique. You saw that. You saw how badly he wanted it. And you used it against him. You made him believe he had finally found what he'd been searching for. You made him believe he was enough. And then you took everything from him. His money. His trust. His life. I want you to understand something. I have to live with the fact that I suspected you. I suspected you for months. And I didn't say anything. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself to let Marvin be happy. I told myself it wasn't my place. I was wrong. And I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. But you don't get to carry guilt, because that would require a conscience. And you don't have one. My brother wanted real love. You pretended to give it. But you took the only thing he ever asked for, a chance at a life that saw him as enough. I hope you spend every day of your sentence remembering his face. I hope you hear his voice in your dreams. I hope you never forget what you did, because I never will. Darnell stepped away from the podium. He did not look at Dominique again. He walked out of the courtroom, past the reporters, past the cameras, and into the sunlight. His brother was gone. Justice had been served, and nothing would ever be the same. In the years since the trial, the Marvin Washington case has become a reference point for discussions about vulnerability, trust, and the exploitation of loneliness. Disability rights advocates have cited it in campaigns for better protection of vulnerable adults. Legal scholars have analyzed the role of hidden surveillance in domestic investigations. Psychologists have studied Dominique Harris as a case study in predatory behavior. But for those who knew Marvin, the case is not a reference point. It is a wound. Darnell Washington sold his brother's house in 2021. He donated the proceeds, along with the remainder of Marvin's estate, to organizations supporting people with disabilities. He established the Marvin E. Washington Foundation, which provides grants for accessibility modifications and independent living support. He speaks occasionally at conferences and community events. He does not speak about his guilt. He does not speak about the camera. He does not speak about the moment he realized he could have saved his brother's life. Those things stay with him, private and permanent. Dominique Harris and Terrell Jackson remain incarcerated at separate facilities in the Georgia Department of Corrections. Neither has shown remorse. Neither has apologized. Neither, according to prison officials, has received a single visitor since their conviction. This story ends with questions that have no answers. In a world where vulnerability is easy to exploit, how many people like Marvin fall in love with someone who was never really loving them back? How many marriages are performances? How many smiles are strategies? How many I love yous are transactions? We want to believe that love is recognizable, that genuine affection is different from imitation, that we could tell the difference if we were in Marvin's position. But could we? Really? If someone studied our loneliness the way Dominique studied Marvin's, if they learned our fears, our hopes, our deepest desires, if they reflected back exactly what we wanted to see, would we recognize the deception? Or would we let ourselves believe because believing felt better than doubting? Marvin Washington wanted love. He found a performance, and he paid for that mistake with his life. If the camera hadn't been there, Dominique Harris would be a wealthy widow living in the Maldives. Terrell Jackson would be beside her, and no one would ever know what really happened in that house on September 14th, 2019. That's the final truth of this story. Justice came because of a hidden camera and a brother's paranoia. It came by accident. It came by luck. And for every Marvin Washington whose killer is caught, how many others never receive justice at all? Now here's my question for you. What story should we cover next? Is there a case that's been on your mind? A crime that never got the attention it deserved? A story that needs to be told? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Your voice matters. And the next documentary we produce might be the one you recommended. And if you want to be part of something bigger, if you want to support the work we do here and get access to exclusive content, extended episodes, and behind-the-scenes research, consider joining our YouTube membership. Every member helps us keep these investigations going. Every member helps us tell the stories that matter. The link is right below this video. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and never stop asking questions.